free period that's non-curricular time, what kind of access they get to student funding. Generally, they get the same as any other student group. The new testing ground here is going to be the limited membership issue. Now, I'm in a sense prophesying here because there aren't yet many High School Equal Access Act cases about this, but there was one in the Ninth Circuit, which is usually fairly cutting edge in these areas and sometimes comes down differently on the subject than other circuits do. But there's been an extremely important university test, Christian Legal Society versus Martinez, about the Christian Legal Society at Hastings. And it would take an hour to go through all that in detail, and I'm not going to. But once the dust settled on that, the upshot is the university could require that all student groups have completely open membership, that there be no membership requirement. So CLS could not require either its, well, it never did require its attendees to be Christians. It did require its voting members and officers to be Christians. So the university was able to say, it was actually a law school, they were able to say, no, you can't do that. Now, of course, the implications of that are that the Democratic Club can't require you to be a Democrat to run for office, and neither can the Republican. It raises issues for the Latino groups. I mean, it's a curious policy across the board because it means no group can have any requirement. The ACLU could be filled with officers who are completely against the separation of church and state. But if the school wants it, they can have it. And there seems to be some indications that that may be coming down in high school groups with the Equal Access Act. So that's an interesting thing to think about, whether you should require a student group to allow anyone to be a member, officer, or director. And personally, I think that would lead to the destruction of pluralism. If nobody can require anybody to believe anything to associate with the group, how can you have any healthy disagreement? But I leave that and move on. Student religious speech. Students have constitutional rights in the public school settings. They don't have the same constitutional rights that you and I have sitting here. And there's a good reason for that. They're stuck inside a building with a whole lot of other kids. And you don't really want kids to be able to say absolutely anything they want to other kids at any time. I was telling Christy earlier, several of our sons had some mild disabilities, high autism spectrum kind of stuff. Well, their lives were tough enough in high school without a rule that anybody could say anything at any time, because they already got bullied enough as it was. So there are some limitations on student speech. Some of us may disagree on the boundaries of those. I don't think any of us are going to disagree that it's a good idea to have some boundaries on those. The case going back to the Vietnam era, Tinker, held that students can say or express controversial speech, in that case it was a black armband, as long as it doesn't interfere with other people's rights or with student discipline. If you get into speech that's sponsored by the school, like the school newspaper, the school has quite a lot of control over that, and that was the Hazelwood case. And there's a lot of complicated tests around this. An interesting case in February, and Lauren drew this to my attention, the ACLU got involved when Christian student athletes in Virginia put up the 10 Commandments on their locker. And the school ripped them down, and the ACLU said, hey, wait a minute, you're allowed to put any other student expression on the locker, generally speaking. You know, goatee and happy birthday, I think Sally is hot, I don't know about that. And so those students also had a right on that space, which had become defined as a personal space, to make their personal statement. As long as it wasn't something offensive, which, you know, generally the 10 Commandments is not considered offensive, even though it's religious. Student prayer. Students have a lot of latitude on prayer, to pray during non-instructional time. Okay, we all know students pray right before exams during instructional time. There's a lot of silent prayer, that's actually constitutional. But not to pray out loud, oh Lord, help me, when you see the math exam. You can have prayer groups like See You at the Poll. If there's a moment of silence, which some states have, you can pray or not pray. You can get excused from instructional time for religious obligations. It's okay for students to speak publicly if it's not attributed to the school. Praying at a football game is attributed to the school, and so that's not okay in the cases. Curiously, the graduation speech, the way that works is, if the school knows what you're going to say and is pre-approving it, that school's speech, and it can't be religious, but in some places where they have a mechanism where the graduation speech is completely student-controlled and everyone knows that the school has no input whatsoever, if the students decide to have a religious speech, that's okay because that's student speech and not school district speech. So it's curious and almost, it's a bit of splitting fine hairs, but that's the way those cases have come down. Students can have symbolic physical expression like religious jewelry. They can have symbolic expression. There might be a day of silence for gay rights. There could be a similar day for a pro-life day of solidarity. Now, here I think there's an important distinction to make, because on either side of the sensitive cultural issues, student speech that's respectful should be appropriate under the case law. To make a polite statement for gay rights, to have a t-shirt that says, I support the Defense of Marriage Act. That should be protected speech. Now, some of these cases revolve around t-shirts that say really nasty things about other groups of people. You know, God hates so-and-so. And I suppose you can say with some distaste that that is technically religious speech, but my view on that is also bullying. When it gets to be a statement that's hurtful and wounding to someone else, that may be okay out on the public street where you've got your full constitutional rights to be as nasty as you doggone well want to be, but not in school because you're around another vulnerable population. And as one analyzes that, I believe that's an important distinction to make. How is a student expressing religion, and what are they expressing towards other people in that context? So, just briefly mention the graduation speech. I meant to mention this earlier. We have one of the cases in Colorado, Porter versus Lewis Palmer. Are you all familiar with that case? You may be. Okay, well it's an interesting twist because Lewis Palmer, and I had a couple kids who graduated from there, they don't weight the grades, and so they have like 20 valedictorians every year, and everybody gets to speak for about a minute. And one young lady, without sharing ahead of time her plans at the school, made a fairly brief but definite statement about her Christian faith. Similarly, I might say, to what Tim Tebow says. But this was at the graduation. And I don't know how many people in the audience were offended. Undoubtedly, some were. The school went a bit nuts and told the young lady that she couldn't have her diploma without a public apology, which she ended up giving in order to get the diploma. And then they had a lawsuit about it, and in the end they decided the school was within its rights. Now, within your rights and acting wisely are not always exactly the same thing, and especially in this area of law, you read these cases and you think, how low could somebody have had some common sense here? Everybody on every side of these arguments. Right, Christy? So, teacher expression. Teacher expression in the schools is a lot more limited. Teachers do have some constitutional rights, but for obvious reasons, the problem is when they're in the classroom and in some other context, They're speaking on behalf of the school, and so you get back to school-sponsored speech. And the cases come out a number of different ways on this. The general rule seems to be that if the school has given the teachers a forum to say what they want to say, they can also say it if it's religious, because it's viewpoint discrimination if not. So you can't have every teacher has a personal bulletin board, and it's okay to put up political statements and quotes from Jonathan Livingston Seagull and Shakespeare, but you can't put anything about your faith. Or worse yet, and the case had this, it was okay to put up a Buddhist expression but not a Christian expression. So some of the cases go that way, but more commonly, and in the 10th Circuit, it's a strict, the school is not opening the forum, and because it's not opening the forum and it's their bulletin board, the teachers can't express that. And then an instructional curriculum in the classroom, they also can't make statements of religious faith, and that's pretty general. As someone mentioned earlier, if someone asks a question, you can respond briefly and appropriately, but you're not supposed to go on about it. There was an issue January, well, I guess just in the last couple of weeks, since we're in January of 2012, the ACLU's been involved in a couple of cases on this. One is Fellowship of Christian Athletes Motivational Speakers come to speak, and the issue isn't so much that they come to speak, but that there may have been once or twice where the remarks crossed the line more into Christian motivational speaking, and the school, the ACLU, reminded them shouldn't be sponsoring that. And I think that's at the we'll be a little more careful stage. Now in Rhode Island, there's an interesting case where the school took down a prayer banner that had been up about 25 years at the ACLU's request. An atheist student, along with the ACLU, sued the city. And that's an interesting area of question because it was a very generic prayer. It was sort of along the lines of, "Our Heavenly Father, help us all to be nice to each other and be good sports and study hard and be good citizens. Amen." I mean, those weren't the exact words. And the question that raises is the whole question of, is any expression of religion allowed in the public square? And most of the emotion that you see swirling around something like that is about that question. And I'll return to that briefly in a little bit. But we were still talking about teachers and school employees. Teachers can go off and pray in their own groups. They can't pray in a public setting or a group of students publicly. And they can do whatever they want on their own time. So however weird it may be, they can pray at their kid's soccer game or football game on the weekend or other things like that. Or they can teach in Sunday school. If they happen to be running into the same groups of kids, which they well may, especially in a small town, that's okay. When they're not on the school dime, they have all of their constitutional rights. Access to schools by religious groups is a really interesting subject. Generally speaking, if community groups have access, religious groups also have to have access. If community groups can give out flyers, religious groups have to be included. They can't have special privileges. They can't have their viewpoint discriminated against. So if you've got 10,000 flyers going home in the kid's backpack, the Child Evangelism Fellowship gets to do it too. There's a very interesting long-run battle in New York right now that culminated in a Second Circuit decision which has been requested. There's a petition for certiorari to the U.S. Supreme Court. I have no idea if they'll take it. I think it's fairly likely. And the long drawn-out battle is over whether the school district can prevent this church from meeting on its facilities. Other community groups